I would like to acknowledge the presence in the room, she wasn't here previously, of Karen Bradbury. Karen, please stand up. Thank you, thank you. She was absolutely essential for us to put on this conference, and I want you to know you have a very grateful AAUP here. Our next speaker is from an organization that we all should be giving money to. Get your checkbooks out, okay? It's a union of concerned scientists. They work for us. They're there for us. His name is Ken Kimmel. He is the president of the Union of Concerned Scientists. They have a website, by the way, we can contribute right there very easily, and I urge you to do that. The Union of Concerned Scientists is a leading science-based nonprofit that combines the knowledge and influence of the scientific community with the passion, I love that word, of concerned citizens to build a healthy planet and a safer world. Mr. Kimmel has more than 30 years of experience in government, environmental policy, and advocacy. He's a national advocate for clean energy and transportation policies and a driving force behind Union of Concerned Scientists' Power Ahead campaign to build a large and diverse group of clean energy leadership states. He started his legal career in legal challenges to Agent Orange and helping defend people who came back with and I have relatives that this has affected. He has served as a general counsel at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs in Massachusetts under Governor Duval's administration, and he has spent 17 years as the director and senior attorney at a Boston-based law firm specializing in environmental energy and land use issues. By the way, just as a coincidence, both he and Lee McIntyre live in Newton, Massachusetts, and I just found out both went to Wesleyan University in Middletown. They said they didn't even know. He has decided to focus his legal work on environmental issues after clerking for the U.S. District Court in San Francisco, where he assisted a judge in a case involving the health effects of Agent Orange. Originally from New York, where else? He earned his bachelor's degree at Wesleyan and his law degree at UCLA. So, Ken, please, thank you. Somebody's going to need to help on this. I don't know how to do it.
Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Before I start, I just wanted to know what a special day today is. Not only is it Earth Day, but a few hundred miles south, leaders from all over the world are in New York to sign the Paris Agreement, which was really a triumph of multinational diplomacy. We're going to hear, and we already have heard, a lot of dark things today about climate denialism and our broken political system, and all those things are true. But it's also true that we agreed on a path forward to deal with climate change that is truly historic. Of course, the implementation is the big question we all face, but we should be glad about where we've come. We should be proud of that agreement, and we should honor all of us who contributed to making that agreement a reality. So this morning you've heard already some very rich talks about both the philosophical and psychological underpinnings of denialism and how that finds its expression in climate change. I'd like to talk about an aspect of this that's somewhat more direct. I believe that some of the denialism that we see in American politics actually has a more direct cause. I believe that it was manufactured by the companies that have a vested interest in denialism, some of the leading fossil fuel companies. And so what I'm going to talk about is what we know about that campaign, what we know about its effects, and what we can do about it. To start the story, I'm going to go back to approximately the year 1988. That's a year in which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed. It was the year that James Hansen testified, and climate change really became a leading issue. One of the remarkable things that has come out in the last several months due to investigative journalism is that the fossil fuel companies knew all about climate science many years before 1988. They were doing some of the leading scientific research on this topic, and their findings very much matched what was being said in that year, 1988. But after James Hansen, after the IPCC, the world was starting to have climate negotiations. Policies were starting to go forward to take some of the carbon out of the atmosphere to prevent emissions from getting worse. And how did these companies respond? Well, the first thing they did was they formed a global climate communications apparatus. And before unleashing that, they actually hired their own team of scientists to give them a briefing on what the state of the science was at that time about climate change. And the head of that organization was a guy named Leonard Bernstein, obviously not the composer, but he was Mobil's chief scientist. And I'd like to share with you his exact words, what he told these companies in 1995. I'm quoting. "The scientific basis for the greenhouse effect and the potential impact of human emissions of greenhouse gases such as CO2 on climate is well established and cannot be denied." That was Mobil's chief scientist's words back in 1995. The memo then went on to explore other alternative theories that had been propounded at that time, and the memo basically dismissed all of them and said that they were not capable of explaining the temperature increases and various other things that were being experienced at the time. It turns out that what this scientist said in 1995 very much matched what Exxon's chief scientific advisor said in 1978. And again, I'm quoting, "Present thinking holds that man," and I realize that is an out-of-date stereotype, but that's what he said, "man has a time window of 5 to 10 years before the need for hard decisions regarding changes in energy strategies might become critical." Boy, was that a prescient statement back in 1978. It also turns out that not only did the companies know about this because they had their own scientists working on it, they actually made a whole number of investment business decisions based on what they knew about climate science. They started investing in raising offshore oil platforms to anticipate sea level rise. They took measures to protect pipelines from breaking due to warming ground, and various other things. So we can establish, we know that they knew about the climate science. We know that they were actually acting upon the climate science. So the question back in the 90s is, what did they decide to do with that knowledge? And there were three paths that they could have taken. One would have been to widely disseminate what they knew and sound the alarm bells about this. And imagine the credibility that the oil companies would have had at that point if they had disclosed and revealed all this with no financial incentive to do that. And actually, there was one company that for a very short time did choose that path. There was British Petroleum back in 1997, I believe. You may remember they, for a while, they called themselves Beyond Petroleum, and they acknowledged climate change and they invested in renewable energy, but that commitment didn't last very long and it kind of fizzled out. The second path would be to really say nothing about what they knew and continue with the business as usual path, and some of the companies certainly did that. The third path was to create a campaign of disinformation and denial to discourage the political sector from having a sufficient consensus that we would take action to move towards clean energy. And unfortunately, it was the third path that many of the companies decided to go. So the American Petroleum Institute formed a global communications team. It had BP and Chevron and ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil and Shell, and they actually wrote a memo about their communication strategy. It was leaked. Here's what it says, again, their words, not mine. "Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand, and note that word understand is in quotes, recognize uncertainties in climate science. Recognitions of uncertainties becomes part of the conventional wisdom. So that's what the goal of this strategy is. And then in language that can only be compared to Spectre from James Bond movies, they go further on to say, and I'm quoting, unless climate change becomes a non-issue, meaning that Kyoto proposals are defeated and there are no further initiatives to thwart the threat of climate change, there may be no moment when we can declare victory for our efforts. So that's what they said. In the memo, they lay out a strategy about how to achieve their goal. It involves cultivating contrarian scientists. It involves spoon-feeding journalists with information. It involves getting into the educational curriculum of schools and a lot of public-facing communications. So what happened? They implemented the strategy, and you saw ad after ad, op-ed after op-ed, challenging climate science all throughout the late 90s and the 2000s, at a time period, by the way, when people were still potentially open to this. And Lee points out that you reach a point of no return with people's beliefs where you can't really persuade them anymore. We were not at that point in that era. And unfortunately, this communication had the effect of moving people in that direction. I'll point out just one of my personal favorites from these ads was from Mobile. In 1998, remember, just 3 years before, they had gotten a memo from their own chief scientist saying you can't refute climate science. But here's what it says. The science of climate change is too uncertain. Scientists cannot predict with certainty if temperatures will increase, by how much, and where the change will occur. So a public ad that clearly is refuted by their own scientific evidence. We also saw CEOs of these companies publicly saying these things. I'll give you a minute just to digest this one. Look at what Exxon's CEO was saying in 1997 versus what their chief scientist told them in 1978 about the state of science. Similarly, look at the urgency of the Exxon scientist. Look at the lack of urgency of the Exxon CEO. So, I don't want to over-dramatize this, but in this area, it's hard to find smoking guns like these, and there are a lot of them. It's been exposed. A second piece of the strategy. I told you that part of the idea was to fund scientists that offered an alternative theory. By the way, one of the scientists that they decided to fund was this guy named Willie Soon. He's not actually a climate scientist. And his theory is that global warming and variations in temperature are caused by solar variability from the sun. By the way, that was one of the theories that the ExxonMobil scientists looked at and debunked in the memo. But Exxon and others spent approximately over $1 million funding Mr. Soon, and it was a very unusual funding arrangement. He works for the Smithsonian Institute, and the conditions of his funding were that first of all, Smithsonian would agree not to disclose who was funding Dr. Soon. Second, that these companies that were funding Dr. Soon's work would have the right to review it before it became published. None of that was disclosed, and so for about 10 years, this contrarian science was propagated, and it was very, very influential. It is still cited by many political climate deniers, like Senator Inhofe. So these types of tactics have worked, and again, they provide a little bit of misleading ammunition to those people who are already philosophically inclined to dispute the overwhelming consensus of science. They're that little nugget of apparent scientific validity to add to people's desire to not accept climate science. So they work together with these psychological and philosophical underpinnings. And one thing I want to make clear is this deception is still going on. not as directly as it was back in the 2000s and the 90s, but indirectly. Most of these companies now say on their website that they understand and recognize climate science, but they continue to fund groups indirectly that do everything but recognize climate science and do everything but work for reform. So this is really still with us. So what's been the effect of all this? This is a little bit to me like Alice in Wonderland. On the left-hand side of the page is the international panel, an intergovernmental panel on climate change, and you can see that as time goes on, the level of certainty about climate change increases. Back in 2001, 66% confidence level. Now by 2013, 95% confidence level. And as you may know, the IPCC synthesizes the work of hundreds or more scientists all around the world, so they can speak to the consensus. Similarly, the number of people who in general believe and accept climate science has gone up as the scientific consensus has gone up. But paradoxically, the polarization of this issue has also gone up. So the people who don't believe climate science don't believe it even more strongly than they did before. So we have this strange situation where the scientists are all coming together, general public opinion is coming together, but this fissure between those who accept the climate science and those who don't gets ever stronger. Here's one way to visualize this. This is George H.W. Bush running for president in 1988, saying we're going to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. Can you imagine any of the candidates running for the Republican nomination saying anything remotely like that during today's election? Instead, what we get, and I'm sorry to pick on Ted Cruz, it looks like we colluded, but instead, we get a guy who literally is saying that people who believe in climate science are like flat earthers, and people like him who deny climate science are like Galileo. So it's just, look at what's changed and ask yourself, is it really just an accident that all of that this polarization of beliefs have occurred? And the real shame of this is I'm going back to that 1988 date when the consensus was emerging. We've now doubled our emissions of greenhouse gases since 1988. So if you take that as a time that we knew or should have known what the harm we were causing, we've made things twice as bad since that time, and that's really a tragedy. So what do we do about this? Well, first of all, the good news is that the chickens are starting to come home to roost here. UCS put out a document over the summer called the Climate Deception Dossiers, which I recommend anyone to read, which outlines some of this conduct. In the fall, we saw some stories by Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times and the Columbia School of Journalism that take our work and go many layers deeper. And the political sector is starting to react to this. We have 4 attorneys general who have now launched investigations into this deception. We have 40-odd members of Congress calling for a federal investigation, 2 of the presidential candidates, numerous legal scholars, all looking into the question, what did these companies know? What did they tell their investors? And what did they tell the public? And did they violate the law by doing that? The science is also developing in ways I want to talk about. UCS, in conjunction with many other scientists, are now trying to apportion the relative responsibility of each of these companies for global warming. And what we and others have done, believe it or not, is go back through approximately 150 years of records to painstakingly establish how much fossil fuels each of these companies has introduced into the atmosphere. That's helpful. And you can start getting some percentages. That becomes important because another way that science is evolving is our ability to pinpoint the fingerprint of climate change in certain natural disasters, one being Superstorm Sandy. And to give you an example, those blue areas shown on the map are areas that got hit hard by Superstorm Sandy because of storm surge and a combination of storm surge and sea level rise. Those red areas are areas that scientists say got hit because of 8 inches of sea level rise, that without the sea level rise, they would have been okay. And so if you do the calculations, sea level rise added about $2 billion to Sandy's toll in New York City. Now that doesn't sound like that much, but imagine if you applied the same methodology to the typhoon that Bill McKibben talked about, or the heat waves in Europe and the Middle East, or the drought in California, or the damaged properties. The point of all this is we can pinpoint the relative share of these companies. We can pinpoint with a reasonable degree of certainty how much those emissions have contributed to actual damages. So what do we do with all this information? First of all, we think it's only a matter of time till the state attorneys general actually bring some of these companies to court. And documents will be unearthed, much the way they were in the litigation over the tobacco industry, and we'll probably find out a whole lot more about this. This will undoubtedly assist in shareholder resolutions. It will provide information that will be valuable for the divestment movement. But perhaps most importantly, the United States and other countries need to put in place a whole lot of new policies to meet the pledge we made in Paris and to get a handle on this problem. And we all know that one of the biggest barriers to those policies is the outsized influence of the fossil fuel industry. And so this disclosure, this dissemination of this information, just as what happened with the tobacco companies, we believe will erode their social license. That's the license that companies have that gives them trust and influence in the public sphere and reduce their ability to block reform. So what do we expect companies to do now that this has been exposed? Because we don't think it's too late for companies to behave responsibly. And so our demands are first, complete cessation of any support, directly or indirectly, to climate science disinformation. They've got to get out of the business of that. They have to actually support sensible climate policies. And many of them say, for example, that they support a carbon tax, which we do think could be a workable policy. The problem is, if you look at who they fund legislators that routinely vote against carbon pricing and rarely support those who support carbon pricing. So they have to actually support sensible climate policies, not just with words. There are ways in which these companies could reduce the carbon content of their fuels. They don't have to invest in tar sands, for example. They can get out of those high carbon fuels. And finally, given the overwhelming need, particularly for developing countries, both to deal with what's coming, but also to help them decarbonize their own economies, these companies could start putting funds and make them available for these purposes. So I just want to conclude by saying some of the denialism we see happened for a reason. It didn't happen by accident. But I am encouraged that after many years of sort of giving these companies a free pass, people are starting to notice this conduct and take action. And I do believe, in conjunction with a lot of other things, that this will help us get to the point where we can have really significant transformational climate policy. So thank you very much.
Our cleanup hitter, and he does look like a baseball player. Tall, lean, a little bit like Ted Williams, actually. If those of you old enough like me to remember Ted Williams. Is Timon Roberts from Brown. He is the Idelson Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology at Brown, where he was director of the Center for Environmental Studies from 2009 to 2012. He is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. There are also people who do good stuff for us. He taught at William and Mary. He directed the program in environmental science and policy from 2001 to 2009. And before that, he held a joint appointment in Latin American studies and sociologies and co-directed the environmental studies program at Tulane from 91 to 2001. Timmons was a James Martin 21st Century Professor at Oxford University Environmental Change Institute from 2006 to 2007, and a research fellow at William and Mary's Institute for the Theory and Practice of International Relations. He's a co-author and editor of 12 books and edited volumes, and of over 80 articles and book chapters. His current research focuses on climate change and economic development. It has three threads. One, how shifting economic and political relations between the global North and South affect the United Nations negotiations on climate change. And he promised me he was going to say a few words about the Paris Accords. So I'm looking forward to that. Two, the role of foreign aid in the negotiations and in assisting developing countries cope with climate impacts and greening their economies. And thirdly, what social factors explain national pathways of economic development? Relatively high or low carbon emitters for their level of human development. In all three, his core focus is how inequality affects our ability to address this complex global problems. It's good to know that somebody's still thinking about inequality. Timmons' approach to research is to learn about major social problems by attempting to help address them. He is a co-founder of AidData.org. He is part of an international effort to produce a quantum leap in transparency in climate finance and in foreign aid more broadly. His Climate and Development Lab at Brown provides research support to think tanks, non-government organizations, and the least developed countries group, the world's 48 poorest countries in the United States climate negotiations. He is a leader in Rhode Island's effort to plan for climate changes. The Rhode Island Climate Change Commission was created in 2010 by legislation written by him and his Brown students. And in 2014, he led a group that successfully passed the first comprehensive climate legislation in our state. Professor Roberts has worked for many years with students on greening initiatives and with community groups in local, state, and national governments. He teaches environmental sociology, globalization, and the environment, and practicum group workshop courses on local and global environmental policy issues. He serves on the board of Environmental Change in Society of the National Academy of Sciences and was in 2014 awarded the Frederick Boutelle Award for Distinguished Scholarship by the Environment and Social and Society Research Committee, RC24, of the International Sociological Association. His lab's international work and his leadership on the Resilient Rhode Island Act led to Brown University being named, quote, Green University of 2014 by International Climate Reporting Service, climatehome.org. Timmons, thank you.
So thank you, Frank, Paula, and URI for hosting this. I'm very excited, and to be working with Senator Whitehouse's office on this is really important. There are not many conferences about this kind of thing. We have a lot of science out there showing that climate change is real, and you've heard some of that. But we don't really understand the politics and the sociology of why we're not dealing with this issue very well. So I think the timing is spectacular. What I'm going to do today is talk about why the fossil fuel industry was actually so quiet around the Paris negotiations. And I will do a little briefing, as Frank suggested. Put the mic up a little bit. Yeah. Why? So I'm going to talk about why the fossil fuel industry was quiet. Some theories about that, and then I'm going to talk about, I have to do a little review on what happened in Paris, and then thirdly, talk about how we're going to get past that. And I have a pretty different prescription. It's going to involve basically wartime mobilization, a program to address the problem with rapid decarbonization and going to zero carbon emissions, at least net with renewable energy. And I think that'll have some good impacts on this current impasse that we're facing right now. So each time in the past there was a threat of meaningful action on climate change, powerful actors in the fossil fuel industry mobilized in public and in private to hinder that progress. You heard great accounts of that from Ken, some from Corey, and from Lee. Regardless of one's opinion of their rationale or their ethics, one has to acknowledge they were remarkably effective. Yet this time, in Paris in 2015, it was different. The fossil fuel interests were extremely quiet while 196 countries got together and forged an agreement. Did they see the pact as so non-binding as to be insignificant? Did they see their goals as having been already met before the huge meeting started? Or were climate science denialists and climate action doubtmongers simply unable to gain the traction that they were used to in a changed physical and media landscape? So I guess I need to do a little bit of a wind up on Paris. So the big parts of the agreement were that countries of the world would come in every 5 years with pledges. They're called nationally determined contributions or national climate plans. Ours is the Clean Power Plan in the United States, and each one is different. They're entirely voluntary. This is a whole new system that was come up with in 2009 by the Obama administration, Obama with the ministers and heads of state of the BASIC group, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. So instead of the old Kyoto model of top-down goals, we have instead have a sort of pledge and review system where countries make pledges and then collectively there's a review system. So there's nothing really binding in Paris. That's the negative side. Countries make these pledges, but there is no police or military force that could go in and force them to actually implement them. There's no trade sanctions that would be connected with non-adherence to your pledge. But there is a review mechanism, and there is hope that with these, what's called a stock take, a global stock take every 5 years, that countries will feel the pressure. And as Bill McKibben rightly said in the New York Times editorial the day after the Paris Agreement, what this agreement really does is it gives the power to civil society to force the nations of the world to meet their pledges. And I think he's quite right that that's what's got to happen. And in fact, I'll argue today that the struggle really has to happen at the national level, that the international negotiations are important. I bring groups of students every year from Brown to the negotiations. A lot happens there, but what happens there is determined by what happens back home. There's a lot more details, of course, that I could go through to talk about Paris, but I'm going to be really brief about that. So as we heard already, in the summer of 1997, one of the most important moments, right before the Kyoto Protocol was going to be negotiated, this group of oil and coal industries got together and created the Global Climate Coalition. And it was a sort of a public face of a group that was working behind the scenes. They gave money to the Competitive Enterprise Institute and some other think tanks like the Heartland Institute. They pushed effectively for a resolution in the US Senate, which unfortunately passed 95-0, called the Byrd-Hagel Resolution, which held that the United States should ratify no treaty that bound the country in a way any different than the developing countries like India and China during the same commitment period, which was extremely effective at sabotaging any efforts really by the United States to move forward on climate change and the United Nations. Byrd, Chuck, what was it? Chuck Byrd, did I get that right? No, it's Chuck Hagel and Robert Byrd, yeah. So they were from the states of West Virginia, coal-dominated, and of course the monoculture state of Nebraska, dependent on petroleum-intensive farming. So this resolution, which I learned recently, it was actually non-binding, but people all over the world, and it's often reported as a binding resolution. No, it's just a sense of the Senate resolution. So it's quite important, though, that it's still, people still point to it, and the U.S. Senate really has been the blocking point for a binding treaty. That's really a lot of why the Paris Agreement has had words like should, that the parties, that is the countries, should adhere to their promises and so on, not shall. And the whole, Paris Agreement almost foundered at the very end on that word should, or replacing the word shall with the word should. And it's because you have to get 2/3 vote in the US Senate to ratify any international treaty. So the Obama administration has been forced to go forward basically using existing policy tools like the Clean Air Act, and they're doing so is, they turn all the dials as far as they can go with the existing legislation and came up with the US pledge of 26 to 28% emissions reductions by 2025. The Byrd-Hagel resolution held off the Congress long enough for George W. Bush to be elected, who, despite his campaign promises to address climate change, promptly unsigned the Kyoto Protocol. And so even the US's 5%, 5.5% emissions reductions were immediately off the table. It then took another 8 years for Kyoto to even come into effect in 2005. Without leadership from the world's richest country and the world's largest polluter, the rest of the world was tied up in knots. Every year at the negotiations, countries would come and hope that the US would move this year, and every year the US stalled and blocked. We've heard a lot about, I'm going to skip some of this, about these, the group of representatives of fossil fuel industries sowing these seeds of doubt. You've heard a lot about that. Something that Ken talked about was this sort of, the speakers have talked about this polarization that occurred in the United States. Some research by my colleagues Riley Dunlap and Aaron McCreight, environmental sociologists, describe how Republicans and Democrats were quite similar in their opinions about climate change and what should be done about it until about 1997, and then it sharply diverges. The Democrats get a little bit more worried, and the Republicans get a lot less worried and a lot less supportive of aggressive action on the issue. And they talk really about this effective campaign to sow the seeds of doubt. One thing that sociologists have also found out is that the doubters are largely white males. So there's a paper called Cool Dudes that I encourage people to look at that show really that white males are different from the rest of the world. Minority, citizens and women, they listen to science. When there's a disaster, I mean, I've seen in hurricanes and so on, who tends to stay home to protect the property and think that they can, effectively fight off the danger is the white males. And, if you look at who actually listens to hurricane warnings and evacuates, it's women. So anyway, the women are smarter, as my wife would point out. At other times, like in Copenhagen, before there was high expectations in Copenhagen, and then right before it, there was, of course, the ClimateGate scandal, which was the leaking of emails from the University of East Anglia in Britain from their server. And, there's been several, I think there's been like 8 investigations, and they all showed that there was, in fact, not a scandal, that it was all legit and above board. There was no wrongdoing. But it was enough, really, to sow the seeds of doubt and to throw the climate science into some question. But then there was Paris. So it was different this time. So the question is why? So there was dedicated and strategic leadership from the United States, France, Peru, and even China. The community of nations of the world were able to draft and agree a deal that applied to all nations this time. President Obama appears to have seen climate change as a crucial issue on which he could create a positive legacy. He talks about his children. Remember, he went to Alaska last summer. But I think the key moment really was his joint announcement with China in November of 2014, in which both countries announced their own national climate plans, which really broke the ice, the logjam, because before that everybody was saying, why should we act when the richest and the largest polluting countries aren't acting? China now represents over 30% of emissions. The US is now about 16%. If you add those two up, you have almost half the problem. So that was an extremely important moment. And it's easy to be cynical about China. Their data is not perfect, but the indications are that they're actually exceeding their pledge. They're peaking their emissions, at least from the coal industry, already. They said they would peak by 2030. It looks like their emissions might be peaking very soon. But I think Obama really has done a lot, and his White House team flew all over the world and worked on joint announcements with other countries like Mexico, Brazil, and lots of work with France and Peru and so on. What else can I tell you? There was no October surprise like there was in 2009 with that ClimateGate scandal, which I think is quite interesting. I was actually kind of waiting. It's like, okay, wait, it's coming. But I think that raises the question, why no October surprise? Why was the skeptic movement had the Heartland Institute and CFACT, led by a man named Mark Morano, held a counter summit at the Hotel California in the middle of Paris during the negotiations. But they barely got any coverage at all for this, and the attendance was quite small. My student, Sonia Gerwit, and now I have some other students in my climate and development lab, did an analysis of the media coverage. They looked at now 2,500 articles that came out just during those 2 weeks. The media coverage was massive. That was in newspapers in 13 countries around the world. And they found not a lot of coverage on denialism. There was a little bit in a few places, only in the United States. Am I getting that right? The rest of the world, there was very little coverage. So they've sort of failed really to get the attention. So the question is why? So in 2 blogs, Bob Brule at Drexel University and I have put together some of our thoughts on this. A lot of it is speculative. It needs a lot of research. I don't know if this research is really happening. I guess we heard a little bit of it today from Ken. But there's not a lot of people out there doing this. Those theories are quite different. Our first hypothesis is that the weather, public opinion, and the Pope mattered a lot. And 2015 and 2014 were the hottest years on record. People are perceiving climate change. We did a little analysis that here in Rhode Island at TF Green Airport, the number of days over 80 degrees heat index has gone up by 2 to 3 weeks since the 1950s and the 1960s on average. So the summers are different. They're hotter, they're muggier. The spring and fall are different than they used to be. People are noticing this. So public opinion in the US is shifting, and it's showing a stronger support for climate action. The Pope came in, of course, with his Laudato Si, the encyclical, back in June. The timing was excellent. He went to Washington, D.C. He spoke to the U.S. Congress. And I think that was quite important, actually, in making it more difficult for skeptical congressional representatives or denialists, whichever, to speak openly and dismissively about climate science. And he also made it a moral issue and an issue about poverty and justice. And I think those were very important ties. Frankly, with the large number of Catholic voters, it became much tougher. And the Pope, of course, has had a broad impact and a lot of influence beyond the Catholic faith as well. So I think it's a different year than it was back in 2009 when the Copenhagen Accord was effectively sabotaged. The second hypothesis is that they're just fighting the battle back home. That is, in this theory, the fossil fuel industries didn't bother to undermine Paris because they knew it was going to rely on national level actions. The oil and gas and coal lobbies are much more effective in Washington than they are in Brussels or in Bonn, Germany, which is where the headquarters of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is. Being visibly negative on the big stage in Paris would have been risky for the oil and gas industry. There may have been a big backlash. I think there was a calculated decision to be quiet. Rather, simply sabotaging Obama's Clean Power Plan back home and attacking funding for the EPA, implementation of that effort through congressional appropriations seems to be where they're focusing much more. They're also focused, of course, on tipping the presidential election and are funding presidential candidates, especially on the Republican side. And you could argue that the Republican Party has really become the firewall for the fossil fuel industry in the United States against climate action. And we heard about the candidates in the past. I want to talk just a little bit more about the sort of PR effort that's going on in a moment. And then the third hypothesis was that the treaty was too weak to even bother, that they sort of kept their powder dry for the bigger battle, indeed, back home. That again, the language is should instead of shall, and there's no really binding parts of it. Let's see here. One of the big things is that in the Paris Treaty, one of the great things is that it has a long-term goal of staying below 2 degrees Celsius of warming and aspiring to a goal of 1.5 degrees. That's fantastic. but we really lack any plan to get our societies, our economies, to stay below those levels. That's the difficult part. And I have an op-ed in the Projo today, and it's on Brookings today as well, about this difficulty of dealing with that scientific truth that it's going to be damn hard. We've got to slam on the brakes on fossil development and, in fact, turn off a lot of the fossil fuels we're using very quickly and switch very quickly to renewables, with the reality of the sort of political roadblocks that we face, especially in Congress. So we're trying to understand the strategy of the industry. And I think, you know, with Exxon being investigated in the courts by the district attorney, the state attorneys general, and being criticized in Congress makes it hard for ExxonMobil to lead this charge this year as well. And our read is that they're really taking a longer-term strategy of investing in PR efforts. For example, ExxonMobil, actually, if you go on their website, they released a statement of support of the COP21, the Paris Agreement, in which they maintain their support for an all-of-the-above energy strategy. On the other hand, though, ExxonMobil was working, as was pointed out, with other fossil fuel interests, again, to push for this stay on the implementation of the Clean Power Plan, right, by the Obama administration. So the Supreme Court, what is that now, 2 months ago, said, sorry, states don't have to implement that right now. And then Justice Scalia died, and so now it's sort of in limbo. It's going back to the lower court. We'll hear in June what happened with that. So it may actually go back into effect, but we heard on NPR some pieces looking around the country, and some states have just stopped implementation. So in fact, that was quite effective. This group that was on Ken's slide, the ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, was meeting in Scottsdale, Arizona, exactly at the time of the Paris negotiations, drawing up plans for how they would scuttle the, and stop the Clean Power Plan and the U.S. pledge that was going forward in Paris. And they've already, orchestrated these lawsuits against the EPA. And a lot of that is funded by fossil fuel industries. Exxon also said that they were in favor of a carbon tax, but it was unclear, really, if you look at their statements by their officials, whether they, in fact, do support it. What I think is really interesting is this advertising campaign on TV. I don't know if people watch the Sunday morning shows or during the presidential debates, or really a lot of different times we see these campaigns, ads from ExxonMobil, talking about how energy lives here, their Be an Engineer campaign. Chevron's ads talk about their staff as doers, which to me implies that everybody who is against fossil fuel development is not a doer, or is a undoer, or is a anti-doer, which is, of course, in our doer society of, just considered an evil, bad element. And then there's this Vote for Energy campaign, which has been running. Have you seen this? If you have to look very hard to find out that it's actually from the American Petroleum Institute. And it talks about how voters should sign their pledge, which is to support a true all-of-the-above energy strategy that values and leverages America's full range of energy resources. So we're guessing that there's going to be a lot of investment in the campaign, especially once the conventions are over. So they didn't really need to play that hard in Paris. And again, as was mentioned in some of the early talks, that really people just want to be reassured that they shouldn't have to do much about this issue. It's really an uphill battle to get people to move on the issue. I have a colleague, Kari Norgaard, who's now at University of Oregon, wrote a book called Climate of Denial, in which she talks about how really people don't want to feel bad about themselves, which this issue can create that feeling. So we collectively support the sort of quiet and the denial about the issue. So just some last remarks here to finish up, and that is to say, I would approach the issue with really the need for really an ambitious drive to zero carbon emissions as quickly as possible. The science is saying we should probably get to 100% renewables by 2030 in the wealthy countries. Our state plan that we just passed in 2014 said we would get to 80% emission reductions by 2050. So you can see there's huge gaps, and there is some dispute in the science about how quickly, but it's also what level of risk are we willing to accept in terms of our likelihood of surpassing these temperature thresholds that are associated, and in our best guesses, with extremely disruptive impacts on our climate system that supports the society. And I could go on about that a lot, and maybe in the discussion time we'll have time. But I would say that in this blog and in the op-ed today in the Projo, I talk a lot about the programs that we have in Rhode Island that can be scaled up. We have a great start. We're one of the most efficient states in the country. And I think really it's by doing things that people feel empowered, both the people who are currently know that climate change exists, have support for action but don't know what they can do, that if we show that there are things we can do, that we aggressively as a society start to address them, that whole group of people will be mobilized to support stronger action. What's more, I think a lot of the denialism is based on a feeling of that this is an issue that's just too hard to deal with. People are starting to see that with the collapse in price of renewable energy, that solar is now coming onto the grid and onshore wind at levels below the price of natural gas, below the price, and soon to be below the price of coal. In some parts of the country, onshore wind is cheaper than coal to install. So as people start to see that, they will see that, well, wait a minute, I should rethink the science. That in fact it's backwards. People don't act based on the science. Rather, they believe based on what their actions have been and whether they see something as actually practical to address. So I guess my prescription for how we're going to address this problem is to get the country moving. We have some precedents for this. The U.S. Wartime mobilization during World War II, in which we transformed our industries in just a couple years, was extremely effective. We could have an Apollo project. We've gotten to the moon in 10 years. And some people have used that as an analogy. I think it's not a bad one, but that's quite a government-led one. I think it's really important, and especially with the falling price of renewables, that this is becoming a private and a public action. So I think I covered everything I wanted to, but I was going to say also that transition needs to come with it real attention to the communities and to labor, to workers who are going to lose their jobs in, for example, coal producing regions, in factories that will have to be retooled to produce with a new feedstock, let's say in the chemical industry or plastics and so on, to renewables. This could be a huge job creator. In fact, in Rhode Island, we had an analysis done by the Regional Economic Models Group, REMI, for our carbon pricing proposal that's called Energize RI, and we have a great website called energizeri.org. And the analysis showed that this would, putting a price on carbon would have a net 4,000 jobs in the next 25 years. It would create about 2,000 jobs in just a few years. In fact, the Clean Energy Report just came out from the Office of Energy Resources of the state a few days ago, showed that clean energy jobs in Rhode Island went from 10,000 last year, which surprised everybody, to 14,000 this year. That's 40% increase. In fact, in the renewable part of that increase, the increase was 84% increase in jobs in 1 year, which is stunning. And this is money that would have otherwise just gone pouring out of our state to pay for fossil fuels that we import from Pennsylvania, where they're fracking, or from Louisiana and Texas, or from Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and all the other places that we get fossil fuels. So there's a huge benefit to our local economy, to our national economy, to workers, to communities. If we can make this transition, it could really change things. And I think that's the way that we'll address this denialism and skepticism. Thanks.